Richmond, Virginia, December 24th, 1842. The city glowed with warmth that winter evening. Candles burned in windows, wreaths hung from iron gates, and the carols of church choirs spilled into the cold air. In the great white mansion that sat atop the hill, Governor Nathaniel Asher prepared to host the grandest Christmas feast the capital had seen in years. Laughter and music echoed to the decorated halls. The smell of roasted goose, spice cider, and sugared fruits filled every room. But beneath the shine of chandeliers and polished silver, another world stirred in silence. Down in the kitchens, in the smoke and heat of the scullery, a young maid named Clara watched every detail. She wore her apron tied tight, her hands raw from scrubbing, her eyes fixed not on the feast above but on the fire that roared in the hearth. Clara was 24 years old, born on the Ashford estate, the daughter of a seamstress who had died when Clara was only 12. Her mother's final words had been a warning. Never trust a promise from the governor's family. They offered freedom like a gift, only to take it back when it served their power. Clara had grown up with that warning carved into her heart. For years she worked in silence, polishing floors, mending sheets, serving at tables. She learned to move without sound, to bend without breaking, but she also learned to watch. She noticed how the governor's hand lingered too long on the shoulder of young girls, how his sons laughed while servants struggled, how his wife kept her own secrets buried in perfume and locked cabinets. Clara knew every shadow in that house, and she carried them all like coals waiting for air. Her breaking point came the winter her younger brother, Samuel, was sold. He was only 15, clever with tools, quick with a smile. He had been promised his place would remain in Richmond, working in the stables. But when the governor's debts swelled after another failed land deal, Samuel was traded to a man traveling south. Clara had begged, fallen to her knees in the front hall, begging for mercy. The governor's sons had laughed as she clutched at his boots. Samuel was gone before sunrise, and Clara never saw him again. On that Christmas night, with the city rejoicing above the snow, Clara carried her grief like iron in her chest. The mansion was filled with guests, senators, judges, merchants, all gathered to toast the governor's power. Musicians played by the staircase. Children ran beneath the great tree in the parlor. Wine spilled into crystal glasses. And in the kitchen, Clara fed the fire. She placed extra logs into the hearth, fanning the flames higher. Each spark reflected in her eyes. She whispered her brother's name as if it were a prayer. The plan had lived in her mind for months, waiting for the night when the house would be at its fullest, when the family would be too drunk on their own pride to notice the servant girl who never smiled. Clara moved quietly through the corridors, carrying trays of food and pitchers of cider. She listened to the governor boast about his land, about his control of the courts, about how the city would always remember the Ashford name. She heard the guests cheer, raising their glasses. She saw the portraits of the family hanging on the walls, painted in oil and gold frames, staring down with cold, painted eyes. She felt her mother's warning burn inside her again. Never trust them. Never forget. By 10 o'clock, the house was alive with noise. The governor's son sang loudly with the musicians, slurring words between cups of brandy. The governor's wife floated from guest to guest, her jewels flashing in the candlelight. No one looked at Clara as she slipped back into the kitchen, her face pale but steady. She had already prepared what she needed: straw hidden beneath the stairwell, oil stolen from the lanterns, poured carefully along the wooden beams of the cellar, cloth soaked and ready, tucked behind barrels. All of it gathered piece by piece over weeks, never enough at once to raise suspicion. When she returned to the kitchen, she opened the door to the cellar and carried a small candle down the steps. The smell of oil rose thick in the air. She placed a flame against the soaked cloth, and it caught at once, spreading along the beams with a hiss. She whispered Samuel's name again, and her hands did not shake. Above, The musicians struck a louder tune. Guests clapped and laughed. The governor raised his glass to shout another toast. None of them smelled the smoke that began to crawl through cracks in the floorboards. None of them noticed Clara slipping back into the shadows of the hall, her apron still tied, her steps slow and calm. The fire spread quickly. Flames licked the edges of the cellar walls, then climbed toward the kitchen. Heat rolled upward, pressing against the floorboards. The first curl of smoke entered the dining hall, thin as a ribbon. A guest coughed, waving his hand, but the music drowned his words. Clara watched from the doorway, her face blank as the room continued to whirl in song and laughter. Minutes passed before the smell grew too strong to ignore. Another guest cried out, pointing toward the kitchen door, where black smoke now gathered in thick clouds. The musicians faltered, the governor frowned, and confusion rippled through the crowd. Then came the crack, a sharp, splitting sound as a beam in the kitchen gave way, and fire burst into the hall like a living thing. Screams filled the mansion. Children were pulled from under the tree. Women clutched their gowns. Men shouted for water. The governor barked orders, his face red, his voice breaking. But the fire had already found the stairwell, racing upward, swallowing portraits and curtains, devouring every polished rail. Clara stood still in the chaos. Smoke curled around her, ash falling like dark snow. She watched the governor shove his guests aside, trying to force a path to the door. She saw his son stumble, drunk and useless, coughing as they clung to the banister. She saw the great Christmas tree, covered in candles, catch fire in an instant, turning celebration into an inferno. The mansion roared as if the very earth wanted it gone. Flames climbed higher, smashing windows, bending iron. Guests poured into the night air, their fine clothes blackened, their cries carrying into the streets. The bells of the nearest church began to ring, warning the city of the blaze. And through it all, Clara walked. She moved with the smoke, her eyes on the governor, her face calm as the fire lit the night behind her. She did not run. She did not scream. She carried only her brother's name in her heart, steady as the flames. Outside, neighbors gathered in horror, watching the governor's mansion burn. They saw the governor himself dragged, coughing into the snow. His pride melted into fear. They saw his sons collapse beside him, gasping for air. They saw the governor's wife faint, her jewels scattered across the ground. But they did not see Clara slip into the dark streets, her apron gone, her hands empty. They did not see her vanish into the winter night, as the fire consumed everything the Ashford family had built. The bells kept ringing. The mansion burned until the roof fell, until the great pillars cracked, until nothing remained but ash and smoke against the Christmas sky. And Clara, the maid no one noticed, was gone. The fire raged until dawn. By the time the first light touched the city, the governor's mansion was a blackened skeleton. Only the stone steps and a few scorched columns still stood, reaching like broken teeth into the gray sky. Ash fell across Richmond like snow. The streets were filled with whispers, rumors spilling faster than the smoke. People spoke of screams that echoed through the night, of carriages overturned in panic, of fine ladies stumbling through the mud in silk gowns turned to rags. They spoke of the governor coughing blood into the snow, of his sons weeping, of the servants scattered like shadows into the streets. And among these whispers, one name began to rise, Clara. In the days that followed, Richmond was a city divided. For the governor's allies, the fire was nothing short of treason, a violent crime meant to shame the highest office of Virginia. For others, especially those who lived in the quarters and worked in silence, it was something else. Justice carried out by a girl whose grief had been ignored too long. The governor survived, though his face and hands bore scars that no ointment could heal. His sons, bruised but alive, swore vengeance. His wife hid away, refusing to be seen in public, her jewels now gone, her beauty dimmed. The family that once ruled Richmond with pride and wealth now sat in the ruins of their own home, broken and humiliated. Clara did not hide far. She stayed in the alleys of the city, moving at night, slipping through places no gentleman would dare to tread. For days she listened to the city gossip, hearing her story take shape in the mouths of strangers. Some said she had danced in the fire. Others swore she had vanished like smoke, carried by angels. Each version grew larger, feeding the myth. But the governor's men searched without rest. Rewards were posted. Dogs were sent into the streets. Every servant girl in Richmond was questioned. Rumors of Clara's face appeared everywhere. Dark eyes, scar on her wrist, hair bound in a red scarf. The city was a net tightening around her. On the 6th day after the fire, Clara was found. She had taken shelter in an abandoned stable at the edge of town. When the governor's men arrived, she did not run. She stood in the doorway, her hands empty, her eyes calm. They dragged her through the streets, but she did not cry. Crowds gathered to see the girl who had brought down the great mansion. Some shouted curses, others whispered prayers. Many simply watched in silence, unable to look away. The trial was swift. The governor demanded death. He called her ungrateful, wicked, a servant who had bitten the hand that fed her. He told the court that Clara had acted alone, that no one else could have planned such destruction. He spoke of his family suffering, his home reduced to ashes, his name dragged through the mud. His voice shook with rage as he demanded she hang before the new year. But Clara said little. When asked why she had done it, she spoke only once. Her words were quiet, but the court fell still to hear them. "I set the fire," she said, "because you took my brother. You promised him safety, then sold him south in the night. You burned my family long before I burned your house." The governor's face twisted, his son shouted, but Clara did not look at them. She kept her eyes forward, her voice steady. "I do not regret the fire," she said. "I regret only that Samuel was not here to see it." The court erupted in noise. Some demanded her execution. Others sat in silence, struck by her words. The judge, bound by law and fear of the governor, sentenced her to hang within the week. Clara bowed her head once, then was taken away in chains. Her final days were spent in the city jail, a dark stone building near the river. She shared a cell with no one, but the guard said she never wept, never begged. She sang at night, low hymns her mother had taught her, hymns that drifted through the iron bars and out into the cold streets. People came to stand outside the jail just to hear her voice. Some wept when they realized the girl singing was the same Maid who had burned the mansion. Christmas had turned into New Year's, and the city could not stop speaking her name. For the enslaved, Clara became a symbol. Mothers whispered her story to their children, calling her brave, calling her a flame that would not die. For the powerful, she was a threat, a warning that no mansion was untouchable, no master truly safe. On the morning of her execution, the sky was heavy with clouds. Crowds filled the square, pressing close against a wooden scaffold. Merchants, workers, women, children, all gathered to see the girl who had struck at the governor himself. Some came to jeer, others to mourn, but all came to witness. Clara walked with her head high. She wore a simple white dress, her hands bound, her step steady. The governor and his son stood at the front of the crowd, their faces twisted with anger and triumph. They wanted to see her broken, but Clara was not broken. She climbed the steps slowly, each board creaking beneath her feet. When she reached the top, the hangman asked if she had final words. Clara looked out at the crowd, at the sea of faces, at the gray sky above. She spoke softly, but her words carried. "They took my brother," she said. "They lied and they stole, and no one stopped them. I set the fire because I could not let their house stand while Samuel was gone. Let the ashes remind you, Every promise broken leaves a scar. Silence followed her words. The hangman placed a rope around her neck. The governor's sons leaned forward, hungry for the moment. The trapdoor fell, and Clara's body dropped. The crowd gasped. Some cried out, but in the silence that followed, her words lingered like smoke. Every promise broken leaves a scar. That night, long after her body was buried in an unmarked grave, people whispered her name through the city. They said the fire was still burning in the ruins of the mansion. They said her voice still echoed in the jail. They said her brother, wherever he was, must have heard her. Clara of Richmond did not live to see freedom, but her story spread beyond the city, carried on whispers and songs. For years afterward, whenever the governor passed through the streets, people would murmur her name. And every Christmas, when candles were lit in windows, someone always remembered the maid who turned celebration into fire. The governor thought Clara's death would close the wound. He believed the people would forget that the ruins of his mansion would be swept aside and rebuilt, and his family's name restored. But memory is not so easily buried. In the weeks after the execution, Clara's story spread farther than Richmond. Travelers carried it down the river to plantations in the lowlands, to farms in Carolina, to the port of Norfolk where sailors whisper a maid who had set fire to power itself. Her name became a quiet chant, passed in the quarters, spoken in kitchens, hummed in work songs. It was not the governor's rage they remembered. It was Clara's steady voice on the scaffold, her last words burning like embers in the minds of those who had listened. Every promise broken leaves a scar. For the enslaved, those words cut deep. They knew the taste of broken promises, of freedom offered and stolen back, of families torn apart in the night, of kind words that turned into chains. Clara's fire became proof that scars could speak, that silence could end in flame. Children played games where they called her name, pretending to strike a spark from stone. Women whispered prayers for her soul, asking her spirit to watch over their daughters. Men told the story of her brother Samuel, lost in the trade, and they imagined that somewhere he had heard of his sister's act and knew he had not been forgotten. But in the halls of the governor's allies, Clara's story was poison. They warned each other that the fire was a sign, that more would follow. They tightened their grip, fearing that servants might rise in the night with torch or blade. They spoke of terror, of rebellion, of the need for harsher laws. Yet even as they built higher fences and hired more guards, the memory of a single maid slipping into the shadows haunted them. The ruins of the mansion stood for months, a charred skeleton on the hill. Each time the governor walked past, he felt the eyes of the city upon him. Neighbors whispered that he had lost more than a house. He had lost control, and no amount of wealth could cover the shame. His sons carried scars of smoke in their lungs and whispers in their wake. Children in the street sang mocking rhymes about the fire, their laughter sharp as knives. At night, those who lived nearby swore they could still hear the crackle of burning wood, the screams of that Christmas Eve, the echo of Clara's hymn drifting through the smoke. Some said her ghost walked the ashes, her white dress glowing in the moonlight, her hands outstretched as if still feeding the fire. Winter turned to spring, but the legend did not fade. It grew, taking on new shapes with every telling. Some said Clara had escaped the hanging, that a stranger had cut her down in secret and carried her away. Others swore the rope had snapped, that she had walked on the scaffold untouched, vanishing like smoke. In taverns, men told stories of seeing her on the road, eyes bright, hair wrapped in a red scarf, walking south to find her brother. The truth was less magical, but no less powerful. Clara's grave lay unmarked in the earth beyond the city. Yet in the minds of the people, she walked on. Her act could not be bound to soil. It burned too brightly. The governor tried to rebuild, but no stone would stand where the mansion had fallen. Workers swore the ground cursed, tools breaking in their hands. fires sparking without cause. They abandoned the site, leaving it as an open scar on the hill. For years, weeds grew through blackened stones, and the place became known as the Ashes of Ashford. Children dared each other to run through the ruins at night. Lovers carved Clara's name into the fallen columns. Some left flowers, some left scraps of cloth tied in knots. Small offerings to a girl they had never met but whose fire had touched them all. In Richmond's churches, sermons turned heavy. Ministers warned against pride, against the cruelty of masters who thought themselves above God. They did not name Clara, but the congregation knew her story hung in the air. When the preacher spoke of fire and judgment, all eyes lowered and a hush fell. Years later, when new laws tightened chains and new rebellions sparked in secret, Clara's name would rise again. Leaders whisper her as a symbol, a reminder that even the most guarded house could fall. Songs carried her memory into the fields, where voices rose in rhythm, each line ending with her name. For the governor, old and broken, the legend became a torment. Each Christmas, as bells rang through Richmond, he remembered the night his house burned, the maid who had stood silent in his hall, the smoke that swallowed his pride. He lived long enough to see his wealth shrink, his sons scatter, his influence fade. When he died, the people did not speak of his victories or his land. They spoke only of the fire that had consumed him, the scar left by a maid who had once served in his kitchen. Clara of Richmond had no monument, no marble statue, no plaque with her name, but she did not need them. Her monument was the story itself, carried in whispers and songs, in the fear of the powerful and the hope of the powerless. Her fire lived on, burning not in wood or stone, but in memory. Every promise broken leaves a scar, and some scars, once open, never close. The years moved forward, but Clara's fire refused to dim. Time tried to bury her name beneath new scandals, new leaders, new laws. But whenever Christmas returned to Richmond, the story rose again with the ringing of the bells. Parents told it to children as a warning or as a promise, depending on who they were. To the wealthy, it was a tale of fear, of what could happen if servants were trusted too much, if the house was not locked tight. To the enslaved, it was a story of defiance, proof that even one woman, armed with nothing more than oil, straw, and wool, could wound the most powerful man in the city. Some whispered that Clara's spirit had become restless, that she haunted the hill where the mansion once stood. Passers-by claimed they saw a figure in white drifting through the weeds, her hair wrapped in a red scarf, her hands blackened with soot. They said she walked the ruins in silence, her eyes glowing like embers. Others swore they heard her singing in the wind, the same hymn she had sung in the jail before her execution. Whether ghost or memory, she remained, woven into the very stones of Richmond. As the nation inched closer to its own great fire, the war that would split the country in two, Clara's legend grew sharper. Abolitionists, hearing of her story, carried it north as an example of how deeply injustice cut. Writers scribbled her name into pamphlets, telling of a maid who chose flame over silence. In meeting halls, speakers invoked her when they spoke of scars left by slavery, of promises broken, of families torn apart. Clara, once a girl no one noticed, had become a symbol larger than the city that tried to erase her. In the quarters, her name was passed like a secret gift. Elders told children to remember her courage, to carry it in their hearts. Every scar tells a story, they would say. Clara's scar was fire. Yours may be something different, but do not let it be silence. These words carried weight, a lesson that survival was not only in living, but in leaving behind something that could not be forgotten. The governor's family, desperate to shake off the shadow, moved from Richmond, but the name Ashford never recovered. People did not speak of their victories or wealth. They spoke only of their fall. Even decades later, when new generations bore the name, the story clung to them like smoke. In courtrooms and streets, whispers followed. Ashford wasn't at the house that burned on Christmas. Their bloodline became a reminder of pride turned to ash. Clara's brother, Samuel, was never found. Some believed he died on the road, lost to the endless chain of the trade. Others hoped he lived, carrying the story of his sister in distant lands. In whispers, people imagined him hearing of the fire, standing taller knowing that Clara had not let his memory fade. Whether truth or dream, her act tied them together forever, brother and sister bound across distance by one night of flame. As the Civil War swept through Virginia years later, soldiers marching past Richmond's ruins heard her name. Some claimed their officers warned them not to speak of it, that to remember Clara was to invite rebellion into the ranks. But the story could not be silenced. Around campfires, soldiers from both North and South told her tale, each bending to their cause. One side painted her as a dangerous rebel, the other as a symbol of justice long denied. Either way, Clara walked among them, her fire still alive. Even after the war, as freedom came on paper but chains of poverty and fear remained, Clara's memory endured. Freedmen gathered in churches, singing of her courage. Poets scribbled verses about the maid who set the governor's house alight. And in Richmond itself, the ruins of the mansion were left untouched, too haunted by memory to rebuild. Grass grew tall over the blackened stones, and people began to call the hill not by the governor's name, but by hers. Clara's Hill, they whispered, the place where a scar had been carved too deep to heal. Generations passed. The world changed, but still her fire flickered in the stories told at night. Parents spoke her name, so their children would know that power was not unbreakable, that even the strongest walls could fall. And each year, when Christmas bells rang and candles flickered in windows, someone always remembered the maid who set fire to injustice. Clara of Richmond, the girl in the kitchen, the sister who would not forget, the voice that turned into flame. Her story is not written in marble or gold. It is written in ash, in whispers, in scars that never healed. And when the night is quiet and the wind moves through the trees on the hill, some still say they hear her words carried on the air. Every promise broken leaves a scar.